The old pickup truck coughed and wheezed as it pulled up to the massive iron gates of Silverado Ranch. Dust clouds swirled behind the rusted vehicle, and the engine made one final rattling sound before falling silent. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and stared through the windshield at the impressive entrance before him. Golden letters spelled out Silverado Ranch across an ornate archway, and beyond it stretched acres upon acres of green pastures dotted with prize cattle and sleek horses. The contrast between his beaten-down truck and the pristine ranch couldn't have been more obvious. Jake took a deep breath, grabbed his worn cowboy hat from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the scorching afternoon sun. His boots hit the gravel with a soft crunch. These weren't fancy boots. They were old, scuffed leather that had seen countless hours of hard work. His jeans bore patches where the fabric had worn thin, and his shirt, though clean, had faded from years of washing. Jake knew he didn't look like much, but he needed this job more than anything in the world. The past 6 months had been a nightmare he wouldn't wish on anyone. First came his father's heart attack, followed by months of hospital bills that drained every penny the family had saved. Then the bank came calling, demanding payment on loans that his family's small ranch could no longer cover. Within weeks, everything was gone. The land that had been in his family for 3 generations, the cattle they'd raised with love and care, even the small house where Jake had grown up. Now, at 32 years old, Jake found himself starting over from nothing. He'd spent the last month driving from ranch to ranch looking for work. Some places wouldn't even let him through the gate. Others took one look at his appearance and told him they weren't hiring. The few jobs he did find paid so little that he could barely afford gas for his truck, let alone a place to live. Silverado Ranch was his last hope in this part of the state. He'd heard about it from another cowboy at a diner 3 towns over. The man had warned him that the owner was tough to work for, but Jake was past the point of being picky. He needed work, and he needed it now. The security guard at the gate looked Jake up and down with obvious suspicion. "You hear about the job posting?" the man asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and didn't think much of Jake's chances. "Yes, sir," Jake replied politely. "I called yesterday and was told to come in for an interview today at 2 o'clock. The guard checked his clipboard and made a note. "Drive straight up to the main house. Park around back near the staff entrance. Don't go wandering around the property." The main house was more like a mansion. Jake had never seen anything so grand outside of movies. 3 stories of white stone and gleaming windows rose before him, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and fountains. He felt even more out of place as he walked around to the staff entrance, his boots echoing on the polished stone pathway. The woman who answered the door looked at him with the same suspicious expression as the security guard. She was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp uniform, and clearly served as some kind of household manager. "You must be the one here about the stable hand position," she said without warmth. "Mr. Blackstone will see you in his office. Follow me, and don't touch anything." Jake nodded and followed her through a maze of hallways lined with expensive-looking artwork and furniture. Everything gleamed with wealth and importance. The carpets beneath his feet were thicker than any he'd ever walked on, and the chandelier, hanging in the main hallway, probably cost more than his family's entire ranch had been worth. The office they entered was bigger than most people's living rooms. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than functional. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it sat a man in his 50s wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jake made in 6 months. Richard Blackstone looked up from the papers he was reviewing, his cold blue eyes taking in every detail of Jake's appearance. The disgust on his face was barely concealed. He didn't offer Jake a seat or even a basic greeting. "So you're the one looking for work," Blackstone said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I have to be honest. You don't look like much. This is a serious operation here, not some backwater farm where cowboys can just show up and expect handouts." Jake felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand, sir. I'm willing to work hard and learn whatever you need me to know." Blackstone laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Work hard? Let me tell you something, boy. I've built this ranch into one of the most successful operations in the state. I don't have time for charity cases or hard luck stories. If you can't pull your weight from day one, you'll be gone before the sun sets." "I can pull my weight, sir," Jake replied. "I've been working with horses and cattle since I was old enough to walk. My family had a ranch until recently, and I know this business inside and out." "Had a ranch?" Blackstone raised an eyebrow with obvious amusement. "Let me guess. Lost it because you couldn't manage money properly? That's what happens to small-time operators who think they know what they're doing." The words stung because they hit close to home, but Jake forced himself to remain calm. He needed this job too badly to let pride get in the way. "We had some family medical expenses that got out of hand," he said simply. "Excuses?" Blackstone waved his hand dismissively. "There's always something with people like you. Medical bills, bad weather, poor planning. It's always somebody else's fault when things go wrong." Jake bit his tongue to keep from responding. He could feel his temper rising, but he knew that losing it now would cost him any chance at employment. Blackstone pulled out a file and glanced at it briefly. "I suppose I can give you a trial period. The position is stable hand, mucking out stalls, feeding horses, general maintenance work. The pay is $8 an hour, 6 days a week. You'll work from sunrise to sunset, and if I hear one complaint about your attitude or work ethic, you're finished." $8 an hour was insulting for the kind of work he'd be doing, and Jake knew it. Most places paid at least 12 or 13 for experienced ranch hands, but he was in no position to negotiate. "That's fine, sir," Jake said. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow morning, 5 a.m. sharp. Don't be late, I don't give second chances." Blackstone turned his attention back to his papers, clearly dismissing Jake. "Mrs. Henderson will show you out and give you the basic information you'll need." As Jake followed the house manager back through the halls, she handed him a single sheet of paper with rules and regulations for ranch employees. The list was extensive and harsh. No personal phone calls during work hours, no socializing with other staff, no leaving the property during breaks, and a dozen other restrictions that seemed designed to make the job as unpleasant as possible. "One more thing," Mrs. Henderson said as they reached the back door. "Mr. Blackstone expects complete loyalty from his employees. That means no complaining, no gossiping, and no questioning his decisions. People who cause trouble don't last long. Here." Jake thanked her and walked back to his truck, his mind racing. The job was terrible, low pay, long hours, and a boss who clearly looked down on him. But it was still a job, and right now that was more than he'd had in weeks. As he drove away from the mansion, Jake noticed other ranch hands working in the nearby fields. They looked tired and beaten down, going through the motions of their work without any enthusiasm. None of them looked up or waved as he passed. It was clear that morale on the ranch was as low as the wages. That evening, Jake sat in his truck at a roadside diner counting the last of his money. He had enough for maybe 3 more meals and 1 tank of gas. If this job at Silverado Ranch didn't work out, he wasn't sure what he'd do next. The thought of calling his sister and asking for help made his stomach turn. She had her own family to worry about, and he'd already caused enough problems for the people he loved. The waitress brought him a cup of coffee and a plate of eggs, and toast, the cheapest thing on the menu. As he ate, Jake thought about his father and the lessons the old man had taught him about treating people with respect and dignity. His dad would have been disgusted by the way Blackstone had spoken to him today, but he also would have understood why Jake swallowed his pride and took the job. "Sometimes you have to take what life gives you," his father used to say. "But that doesn't mean you have to accept it forever. Work hard, keep your eyes open, and stay ready for when opportunity comes knocking." Jake finished his meal and left a small tip for the waitress, even though he could barely afford it. Tomorrow would be his first day at Silverado Ranch working, for a man who clearly thought he was worthless. But Jake had survived worse things than an arrogant boss. He'd work hard, save every penny he could, and prove that he was more than Richard Blackstone thought. As he drove through the darkness toward the small motel where he'd been staying, Jake made a promise to himself. He wouldn't let this situation break him. Somehow, some way, he'd find a way to build something better from the ashes of what he'd lost. He just had to be patient and keep his eyes open for the right opportunity. The next morning would mark the beginning of what would become the most important 3 months of his life, though Jake had no way of. 3 months had passed since Jake started working at Silverado Ranch, and every day had been exactly as difficult as he'd expected. The alarm on his phone buzzed at 4:30 every morning, giving him just enough time to splash cold water on his face and grab a piece of bread before heading to work. By 5 a.m. sharp, he was in the stables, ready to begin another grueling day. Richard Blackstone had made it clear from the beginning that Jake was at the bottom of the ranch hierarchy. While other workers got to handle the more interesting tasks, like training horses or managing cattle drives, Jake spent his days mucking out stalls, hauling feed, and doing whatever dirty work nobody else wanted to do. The pay was still the same insulting $8 an hour, while newer employees who clearly had family connections or better clothes started at twice that amount. But Jake had learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut. He watched everything, listened to conversations when people forgot he was there, and slowly began to understand how the ranch really operated. Blackstone might own the place, but he spent most of his time in meetings with investors and showing off for wealthy friends rather than actually working with the animals. The real work was done by people like Carlos, an experienced horseman who'd been at the ranch for 15 years, and Betty, the head of cattle operations who knew more about livestock than anyone Jake had ever met. These were good people doing honest work, but they all seemed worn down by Blackstone's constant demands and criticism. Jake had tried to make friends with his co-workers, but most of them were too worried about keeping their own jobs to risk being seen as friendly with the newest hire. They'd learned that Blackstone didn't like it when his employees got too comfortable with each other. He preferred to keep everyone isolated and competing rather than working together as a team. The worst part wasn't even the hard work or low pay. It was the way Blackstone treated him in front of others. At least once a week, the ranch owner would find some excuse to publicly humiliate Jake. He'd criticize his work loudly enough for everyone to hear, make jokes about his appearance, or give him impossible tasks just to watch him struggle. Last Tuesday, Blackstone had ordered Jake to clean and organize an entire hay barn by himself in a single afternoon, work that normally took 3 people 2 days to complete. When Jake couldn't finish in time, Blackstone made him stay until midnight to complete the job, then docked his pay for inefficiency. The breaking point came on a scorching Friday afternoon in early September. Jake had been working since dawn to repair fence posts in the south pasture. The work was backbreaking in the heat, and he'd barely had time for a quick lunch break. As the sun began to set, he was loading his tools into the back of a ranch truck when he noticed something that made his blood boil. Water was gushing from a broken pipe near the horse stables, creating a muddy mess and wasting hundreds of gallons. Jake knew that the horses in the nearby paddock needed clean, fresh water, especially on a hot day like this. Without thinking twice, he dropped his tools and ran to turn off the main valve, then began working to fix the broken connection. It took him nearly 2 hours to get the water flowing properly again, time he should have been heading home to rest, but Jake couldn't stand the thought of the horses going without water overnight. He'd grown up understanding that animals depended on humans to take care of them, and that was a responsibility he took seriously. He was just finishing up when he heard the rumble of expensive cars coming up the main driveway. Jake glanced at his watch and realized it was nearly 8 p.m., well past normal working hours. Through the stable windows, he could see the lights blazing at the main house and hear the sounds of laughter and conversation. Blackstone was hosting one of his regular weekend parties where wealthy friends and potential investors would come to admire the ranch and discuss business deals. Jake had learned to stay out of sight during these events since his presence seemed to embarrass his boss. But as he was putting away his tools, Jake heard footsteps approaching the stable area. A group of well-dressed men and women were walking toward the paddocks led by Blackstone himself. They all held drinks and were laughing loudly about something. "This is where we keep our prize-breeding stock," Blackstone was saying in his boastful voice. "Each of these horses is worth more than most people make in 5 years. Jake tried to slip away quietly, but his movement caught Blackstone's attention. The ranch owner's face immediately darkened with anger when he saw his employee still on the property. "What are you doing here?" Blackstone demanded. "Your shift ended 2 hours ago. Jake straightened up, holding the wrench he'd been using to fix the water line. There was a broken pipe, sir. The horses needed water, so I stayed to fix it. Nobody asked you to stay late, Blackstone snapped. And nobody gave you permission to use ranch tools for unauthorized work. The group of wealthy visitors watched this exchange with obvious amusement. Jake could see them whispering to each other and smiling at what they clearly saw as entertainment. I'm sorry, sir, Jake said quietly. I just thought the animals needed... You're not paid to think, Blackstone interrupted. You're paid to do what you're told when you're told to do it. If I wanted your opinion about ranch operations, I would have asked for it. One of the visitors, a woman wearing more jewelry than Jake had ever seen in one place, laughed out loud. Richard, you really do have to deal with some characters out here, don't you? Unfortunately, yes, Blackstone replied. It's hard to find reliable help these days. Most of these people don't understand the first thing about running a serious business. Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment, but he forced himself to stay calm. He started to walk away, hoping to end the humiliation, but Blackstone wasn't finished with him yet. Hold on there, cowboy, the ranch owner called out. Since you seem to think you know so much about horses, why don't you show my guests what a real expert looks like? The group moved toward the main corral, where several horses were grazing in the evening light. But Blackstone led them past the gentle mares and geldings to a separate paddock at the far end of the stable area. Inside stood a magnificent black stallion, easily the most beautiful horse Jake had ever seen. The animal was huge, probably 17 hands high, with a coat that shone like polished obsidian in the fading light. His mane and tail flowed like silk, and his muscular build spoke of incredible strength and speed. But there was something else in the horse's posture and behavior that immediately caught Jake's attention. This is Thunder, Blackstone announced proudly. Bought him from a breeder in Kentucky for more money than you people can probably imagine. He's supposed to be from champion bloodlines, destined for greatness. He's absolutely gorgeous, one of the male visitors said. I bet he's incredible to ride. Blackstone's expression darkened slightly. Well, there's been a small problem with that. The horse has some behavioral issues. He's a bit aggressive with people. Jake studied the stallion more carefully. Thunder wasn't grazing like the other horses. Instead, he stood in the far corner of the paddock, his ears pinned back and his eyes constantly scanning for threats. When one of the visitors moved closer to the fence, the horse immediately backed away, snorting and tossing his head. Aggressive? Another visitor asked. How aggressive are we talking about? Blackstone waved his hand dismissively. Nothing we can't handle. He just needs a firm hand and proper training. These thoroughbreds can be temperamental. But Jake could see that this was more than temperament. The horse's behavior reminded him of animals he'd known that had been mistreated or traumatized. Thunder wasn't aggressive, he was terrified. Has anyone been able to work with him? Jake found himself asking, forgetting that he was supposed to stay quiet. Blackstone whirled around, clearly annoyed that his employee had spoken up. As a matter of fact, we've had several professional trainers try to work with him. None of them have been successful yet, but that's just a matter of finding the right approach. One of the visitors, a man with silver hair and an expensive suit, chuckled. How long have you had him, Richard? About 2 years, Blackstone admitted reluctantly. 2 years? The woman with all the jewelry exclaimed. And nobody has been able to even approach him? Jake watched as Blackstone's face reddened with embarrassment. It was clear that Thunder had become a source of frustration and humiliation for the ranch owner. Here was this incredibly expensive, beautiful animal that was supposed to be the crown jewel of his operation, and instead it served as a constant reminder that money couldn't solve every problem. It's just a matter of time and patience, Blackstone said defensively. The right person will come along eventually. Or maybe, the silver-haired man suggested with obvious amusement, you got taken for a ride by that Kentucky breeder. Could be the horse is just defective. This comment seemed to hit Blackstone like a physical blow. Jake could see the rage building in the ranch owner's eyes, and he knew that someone was going to pay for this public humiliation. Sure enough, Blackstone's gaze fell on him. You know what? Blackstone said suddenly, his voice carrying across the paddock. Our resident expert here seems to think he knows something about horses. Maybe he can show us all how it's done. The group turned to look at Jake with renewed interest. He could feel the crowd of wealthy visitors pressed against the paddock fence, their expensive drinks forgotten as they waited for what they clearly expected to be a spectacular disaster. Jake could hear them whispering bets about how quickly Thunder would charge, how badly he might get hurt, and how foolish he was for even attempting such a crazy stunt. But Jake wasn't paying attention to their chatter. His entire focus was on the magnificent black stallion standing in the far corner of the enclosure. For 3 months, he'd been stealing glances at Thunder whenever his work brought him near this paddock. What he'd observed during those brief moments had painted a very different picture than the one Blackstone presented to his guests. "This should be interesting," Blackstone announced to his friends, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who was absolutely certain about the outcome. "I give him about 10 seconds before he's running for his life." Jake ignored the commentary and slowly approached the paddock gate. Thunder's ears immediately flattened against his head, and the horse took several steps backward, snorting loudly. To the watching crowd, this looked like clear aggression, but Jake recognized something else entirely: fear. During his months at the ranch, Jake had noticed patterns in Thunder's behavior that others seemed to miss. The horse wasn't randomly violent or naturally aggressive. His reactions followed specific triggers. Loud voices made him panic. Quick movements sent him into defensive mode. Men wearing hats caused him particular distress. Most telling of all, he seemed especially terrified of anything that resembled a whip or rope. These weren't the behaviors of a spoiled thoroughbred with attitude problems. They were the responses of an animal who had experienced serious trauma. "You, sure you want to do this, boy?" Blackstone called out mockingly. "It's not too late to back down and admit you're in over your head." Jake turned to look at the ranch owner and his guests. In the glow of the property's security lights, they looked like vultures gathered around expected carrion. Their faces showed a mixture of cruel anticipation and smug superiority that made his stomach turn. "I'm sure," Jake replied simply, then added something that made Blackstone's confident smile waver slightly. "But I'm going to do this my way, and it's going to take time. Real horsemanship isn't a 5-minute show for entertainment." "Time?" One of the guests laughed. "How much time could you possibly need to walk up to a horse?" Jake looked back at Thunder, who was now pacing nervously along the far fence line. "As much time as it takes to do it right," he answered. "If you're all expecting some kind of quick trick, you're going to be disappointed." The truth was, Jake had been preparing for this moment without even realizing it. Every day for the past 3 months, as he worked in and around the stables, he'd been slowly building a relationship with Thunder from a distance. He'd started by simply being present without trying to interact, mucking out nearby stalls, carrying feed past the paddock, and doing repair work on adjacent fencing. At first, Thunder had retreated to the farthest corner whenever Jake appeared, but gradually, over weeks and then months, the horse had begun to tolerate his presence. Jake had been careful never to make direct eye contact, never to move too quickly, and never to raise his voice when working near the paddock. More importantly, Jake had been leaving small offerings. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just a handful of sweet oats left on a fence post, a fresh apple placed where Thunder might find it, clean water in buckets positioned around the paddock's perimeter. He'd done all of this quietly, during early morning hours or late evenings when no one else was around. The wealthy guests were growing impatient. "Are you actually going to do anything, or are we just going to stand here all night?" the woman with excessive jewelry demanded. "Patience," Jake said calmly. "You can't rush this kind of thing." But instead of entering the paddock immediately, Jake did something that confused everyone watching. He sat down on the ground, cross-legged, about 10 feet away from the fence. Then he simply waited. "What in the world is he doing?" someone whispered. Blackstone looked puzzled and slightly annoyed. "This is ridiculous. Get up and get on with it, or admit you can't do it." Jake remained seated, his eyes closed, breathing slowly and steadily. This wasn't some mysterious technique he'd learned from a book. It was something his grandfather had taught him when he was barely old enough to walk. "Horses are prey animals," the old man had explained during one of their many sessions together. Their first instinct is always to run from danger. If you come at them like a predator, fast, direct, aggressive, they'll treat you like one. But if you can convince them that you're not a threat, that you're just another peaceful creature sharing their space, then you've got a chance to build real trust. His grandfather had been what people called a horse whisperer, though he'd never used that term himself. He'd simply understood that communication with animals required patience, respect, and the ability to think like they did. Jake had spent countless hours as a child learning these lessons, never imagining they would one day be so crucial to his future. After about 10 minutes of sitting motionless, Jake began to notice changes in Thunder's behavior. The horse had stopped pacing and was now standing still, watching him with curiosity rather than fear. His ears were no longer pinned back, and his breathing had become more relaxed. The human audience, however, was growing increasingly restless. "This is boring," one of the men complained. "I thought we were going to see some action." "Maybe he's just stalling because he knows he can't actually do it," another suggested. Blackstone was looking less confident by the minute. "All right, that's enough of this nonsense. Either get in there and touch the horse, or admit you were just wasting everyone's time." Without opening his eyes or changing his position, Jake spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Thunder was abused by his previous owner, probably beaten with whips or ropes. That's why he can't stand quick movements or loud noises. That's why your professional trainers couldn't work with him. They approached him like a normal horse, instead of a traumatized animal. The crowd fell silent, surprised by this unexpected analysis. "That's ridiculous," Blackstone said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "I bought him from one of the most respected breeders in Kentucky. They wouldn't sell damaged goods." Jake finally opened his eyes and looked directly at the ranch owner. "Did you ever actually meet the breeder? Or did you buy Thunder through a middleman?" Blackstone's face reddened slightly. "What difference does that make? I have all the proper paperwork and bloodline documentation. Papers can be forged," Jake said quietly. "But trauma like this doesn't lie." He stood up slowly, making sure not to make any sudden movements that might startle Thunder. The horse was now watching him intently, but without the panic that had been evident earlier. "Watch his eyes," Jake instructed the group. "See how he tracks every movement? That's not aggression. That's hypervigilance. He's constantly scanning for threats because he's learned that danger can come without warning." Jake began moving closer to the fence, but instead of walking directly toward Thunder, he approached at an angle, never making direct eye contact with the horse. This was another technique his grandfather had taught him. Predators stare down their prey, so direct eye contact triggers flight responses in horses. "This is taking forever," the jeweled woman complained. "Can't you just hurry up and get it over with?" "Ma'am," Jake replied without looking away from Thunder. "If you try to rush trust, all you get is fear." He reached the paddock fence and slowly extended his hand, palm up, toward the horse. Thunder immediately backed away several steps, snorting nervously, but he didn't retreat to the far corner as he would have done months earlier. He was actually engaging, which was progress. Jake began speaking to Thunder in a low, steady voice. He wasn't saying anything particularly meaningful, just a constant stream of quiet words that created a calming sound. This was something else. His grandfather had taught him. Horses respond more to tone and rhythm than to actual words. "Easy, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you. I know you've had bad experiences with people, but not all of us are like that. Some of us understand that you deserve respect and kindness." As he spoke, Jake noticed that Thunder's ears were beginning to move forward, a sign that the horse was becoming curious rather than fearful. After several more minutes, Thunder took a tentative step closer to the fence. The wealthy audience had grown quiet, perhaps beginning to realize that they were witnessing something more complex than they'd initially understood. Even Blackstone seemed less sure of himself, though he was still clearly hoping that Jake would fail. "That's it, Thunder," Jake continued in his quiet voice. "You're in control here. You can come closer if you want to, or you can stay where you are. No pressure, no force, just your choice." This was the crucial difference between Jake's approach and that of the professional trainers who had failed with Thunder. They had likely tried to establish dominance to show the horse who was boss. But Thunder had already learned that lesson too well from whoever had abused him. What he needed now was to learn that he had some control over his own fate. After what felt like an eternity, Thunder took another step forward, then another. His nostrils flared as he caught Jake's scent, analyzing this. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The group of wealthy visitors stood frozen, their expensive drinks forgotten in their hands as they stared at Jake and then at Thunder, who remained calmly near the fence line instead of hiding in his usual corner. The magnitude of what they had just witnessed was slowly sinking in. Richard Blackstone's face had gone through several color changes, from confident pink to embarrassed red to a pale shade that suggested he was beginning to understand the implications of what had just happened. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. It was the silver-haired man in the expensive suit who finally broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly. "In 30 years of raising horses, I've never seen anything like that." The woman with all the jewelry was shaking her head in amazement. "Richard, did that cowboy just actually touch your impossible horse?" Jake remained calm, though his heart was pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and satisfaction. He could see the wheels turning in Blackstone's head as the ranch owner tried to figure out how to get out of the corner he'd painted himself into. "Now hold on just a minute," Blackstone finally managed to say, his voice shaky but trying to regain its usual authority. "That was obviously just a fluke. Anyone can get lucky once." "Lucky?" Jake asked quietly. "Sir, I just spent 2 hours earning that horse's trust. That wasn't luck, that was patient, careful work with a traumatized animal." Thunder, as if sensing the tension in the air, moved closer to the fence where Jake stood. The horse's behavior was completely different now. Relaxed, curious, almost protective of the man who had shown him kindness. One of the other guests, a man who had been quiet throughout the evening, stepped forward. "Richard, I hate to be the one to point this out, but you did make that challenge in front of all of us. You said if he could touch the horse, you'd sign the ranch over to him." "It was obviously a joke," Blackstone exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. "Nobody in their right mind would think I was serious about giving away an 8,000-acre ranch." "Actually," Jake said, reaching into his shirt pocket, "I thought you might feel that way." He pulled out his cell phone and held it up for everyone to see. "That's why I recorded your exact words when you made the challenge." The blood drained from Blackstone's face. "You what?" Jake calmly played back the recording. Blackstone's voice came through clearly. "If you can walk up to Thunder there and just touch him, just put your hand on him for 5 seconds, I'll sign this entire ranch over to you. All 8,000 acres, every building, every animal. The whole thing becomes yours." The group of visitors listened to the recording with obvious fascination. When it finished, the silver-haired man whistled low. "Richard, that certainly sounds serious to me. You said you were a man of your word." "I am a man of my word," Blackstone snapped. "But this is different. This is exactly what you challenged him to do," the quiet man pointed out. "And he did it, in front of all of us." Jake could see the panic building in Blackstone's eyes as he realized that his cruel joke was about to backfire spectacularly. The ranch owner looked around at his guests, searching for support, but found none. Instead, he saw a group of wealthy, powerful people who were beginning to look at him with the same mixture of amusement and contempt that he had shown Jake just hours earlier. "You can't be serious about this," Blackstone said, his voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "I'm not giving my ranch to some broken-down cowboy who got lucky with a horse." "Lucky?" This came from Carlos, the head horseman, who had appeared at the edge of the group. Jake hadn't noticed him approaching, but apparently, the commotion had drawn several of the ranch employees out of their quarters. "Sir, I've been watching from over there for the past hour. What that man just did wasn't luck, that was skill." Betty, the cattle operations supervisor, nodded in agreement. "I've worked with horses for 25 years, and I've never seen anyone handle a traumatized animal like that." He knew exactly what he was doing. More ranch employees were gathering now, drawn by the unusual activity and raised voices. Jake could see them whispering among themselves as they realized what was happening. Word was spreading quickly through the ranch community. "This is ridiculous," Blackstone shouted. "I'm not bound by some stupid bet I made while I was entertaining guests. It was a joke, and everyone knew it was a joke." "Actually," the jeweled woman said thoughtfully, "you seemed pretty serious to me, Richard. You made quite a show of it, talking about being a man of your word and all that." Jake had remained quiet during this exchange, but now he stepped forward. "Mr. Blackstone, I understand this isn't what you expected to happen, but you made that challenge in front of witnesses, and I accepted it in good faith. I spent 2 hours doing exactly what you said would earn me this ranch. You think you can just waltz in here and take what I've built?" Blackstone's voice was getting higher and more desperate. "I've put millions of dollars into this place. I've worked for years to make it what it is." "Actually," Jake replied calmly, "from what I've observed over the past 3 months, most of the real work here is done by people like Carlos and Betty, and the other hands you pay poverty wages while you take all the credit." This comment hit home with several of the watching employees who nodded in agreement. Jake could see that his words were resonating with people who had been mistreated and undervalued for years. The silver-haired man cleared his throat. "Richard, I have to say, this is turning into quite an embarrassing situation for you. If word gets out that you tried to back out of a public challenge because you didn't expect to lose, my reputation in the business community would be ruined." Blackstone finished, suddenly looking like a deflated balloon. He seemed to age 10 years in the span of a few seconds, as the full implications of his situation became clear. "There might be a way to handle this quietly," Jake said, surprising everyone. "We could work out some kind of arrangement that doesn't involve public embarrassment for anyone." Blackstone looked up hopefully, but Jake wasn't finished. "Of course, that would depend on you acknowledging what just happened and treating it with the respect it deserves. No more calling it luck or a fluke. What I did tonight was real horsemanship, and Thunder's response proves it." One of the guests pulled out his phone. "Actually, I was recording some of this myself. I thought it would make a great social media story. You know, rich rancher's impossible horse finally tamed. I had no idea it was going to turn into something like this." Blackstone's face went pale again. "You recorded it?" "Oh, yes. The whole thing. The challenge, the horsework, everything. It's quite dramatic, really. I bet it would go viral if I posted it." Jake could see that Blackstone was trapped from multiple angles now. Not only did he have Jake's recording of the original challenge, but there was additional video evidence of everything that had followed. The ranch owner's wealthy friends, who had expected to enjoy his humiliation of a lowly employee, were now witness to his own humiliation instead. "What do you want?" Blackstone asked Jake, his voice barely above a whisper. "Right now I want you to acknowledge that I did exactly what you challenged me to do. I want you to admit that it wasn't luck, and I want you to honor your word like the man you claim to be." The crowd of employees had grown larger, and Jake could see that word was spreading throughout the entire ranch. People were emerging from bunkhouses and staff quarters, all wanting to see what was happening. The story was probably already being texted and called to friends and family members across the county. "And if I do that?" Blackstone asked. "Then we talk about what comes next," Jake replied. "Like I said, this doesn't have to destroy anyone's reputation if it's handled right." But before Blackstone could respond, Betty stepped forward from the crowd of employees. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "but I think there's something else everyone should know about what's been happening on this ranch." Jake looked at her in surprise, wondering what she was about to say. "Jake here," Betty continued, "has been doing more than just the work he was hired for. He's been fixing things around the ranch that needed attention, staying late to make sure the animals were properly cared for, and doing it all without asking for extra pay or recognition." Carlos nodded in agreement. "That's right, he fixed the water system for the horses just tonight on his own time, and last week he repaired the fence in the north pasture that's been broken for months." Other employees began speaking up, sharing their own observations about Jake's dedication and work ethic. It became clear that while Blackstone had been dismissing him as worthless, Jake had been quietly earning the respect of the people who actually did the work on the ranch. He knows more about horses and cattle than most people I've worked with, Betty added. And he treats everyone with respect, from the newest hire to the most experienced hand. Blackstone looked around at his employees with growing alarm. He was clearly realizing that Jake had been building relationships and earning loyalty, while he had been creating resentment and fear. "This is all very touching," Blackstone said sarcastically, trying to regain control of the situation. "But it doesn't change the fact that I'm not giving away my ranch because of some ridiculous bet." The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Richard Blackstone stood in the center of what had become a large circle of people, his wealthy guests, ranch employees, and Jake, the man who had just turned his world upside down. The ranch owner's face went through a series of expressions as he struggled with the reality of his situation. "You're all insane," Blackstone finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "This whole thing is completely ridiculous. No court in the world would actually force me to give away my ranch over a bet." The attorney among his guests shook his head. "Richard, I've been practicing contract law for 25 years. What happened here tonight meets every requirement for a binding agreement. Offer, acceptance, consideration, and performance in front of witnesses. If you try to fight this, you'll not only lose, but you'll also face massive legal fees and public humiliation." Jake stepped forward and Thunder, still standing near the fence, nickered softly as if encouraging him. "Mr. Blackstone, I want to tell you something that might surprise you. I didn't come to this ranch planning any of this. I came here because I was desperate for work after losing everything my family had built." The crowd listened intently as Jake continued. "But over these past 3 months, I've learned a lot about how this place really operates. And I've learned something about you, too." Blackstone looked up sharply, wondering what was coming next. "You're not actually a rancher," Jake said simply. "You're a businessman who bought a ranch because you thought it would make you look important. But you don't understand animals, you don't respect the people who work for you, and you don't have the first clue about what it takes to run an operation like this successfully." Several of the employees nodded in agreement, though they tried to hide their expressions from their current boss. "That's not true," Blackstone protested. "I've invested millions in this place. I've expanded operations, improved facilities, increased productivity." "You've spent money," Jake corrected. "But spending money isn't the same as building something meaningful. A ranch isn't just about fancy buildings and expensive equipment. It's about understanding animals, respecting the land, and treating people fairly." Betty stepped forward from the group of employees. "Jake's right, Mr. Blackstone. I've been trying to tell you for years that the way we treat our animals and our people affects everything else. Happy employees do better work. Healthy, well-cared-for animals are more productive. But you never wanted to listen." Carlos nodded in agreement. "We could have been one of the best operations in the state if things were done right. Instead, we spend half our time dealing with problems that could have been prevented with better management." Jake could see that Blackstone was becoming more agitated as his own employees spoke against him. But he also noticed something else. The ranch owner was beginning to look less angry and more frightened. The reality of losing everything was starting to sink in. "Here's what I propose," Jake said, his voice calm and steady. "I'll honor the agreement we made. You challenged me to touch Thunder, and I did it. That makes this ranch legally mine, according to your attorney friend here." Blackstone's face crumpled with despair. "But," Jake continued, "I'm not interested in destroying anyone's life or taking something that represents years of someone else's work, even if that work was misguided." Everyone leaned in closer, wondering where this was going. "So I'll make you a deal. You can stay here and continue to be involved in running the ranch, but there are going to be some major changes in how things operate." "What kind of changes?" Blackstone asked suspiciously. Jake looked around at the assembled group of employees. "First, everyone who works here gets fair wages, not the poverty level pay you've been offering. Second, decisions about animal care and ranch operations get made by people who actually understand those things, not by someone sitting in an office looking at spreadsheets." The employees began murmuring excitedly among themselves. This was more than they had dared to hope for. "Third," Jake continued, This ranch becomes a place that people are proud to work for. No more public humiliation, no more treating employees like they're worthless, and no more buying expensive animals just for show without understanding how to care for them properly. The silver-haired guest spoke up. That all sounds reasonable, but what's in it for Richard? Why would he agree to stay on under those conditions? Jake smiled for the first time all evening, because Mr. Blackstone is going to learn something he's never had the chance to learn before. He's going to discover what it feels like to be part of something that actually works. I don't understand, Blackstone said. You bought this ranch because you wanted to feel important, right? You wanted to be seen as successful and powerful. But real success isn't about having expensive things or bossing people around. It's about building something that makes a positive difference. Jake gestured toward Thunder, who was still standing peacefully near the fence. Look at that horse. 3 months ago, he was considered worthless, dangerous, untrainable, a waste of money. But the problem wasn't with Thunder. The problem was with how people were trying to work with him. The wealthy guests were listening with obvious fascination. This wasn't what they had expected when they came to the ranch for an evening of entertainment. This ranch has the same problem, Jake continued. It's not worthless, it has incredible potential, but it's been managed by someone who didn't understand what he was working with. Change the management approach and you change everything. One of the female guests spoke up. Are you saying you can actually make this ranch more successful than it already is? I'm saying we can make it more successful, Jake replied, emphasizing the word we. Mr. Blackstone has business skills that are valuable. He knows how to handle finances, deal with suppliers, manage contracts, all things that are important for running a large operation. But he's been trying to do everything himself instead of working with people who have complementary skills. Betty and Carlos exchanged glances, clearly intrigued by this possibility. So what exactly are you proposing? Blackstone asked, his voice subdued but curious. You become the business manager of the ranch, reporting to me as the owner. You handle the financial side, the legal issues, the contracts and partnerships, but all decisions about animal welfare, employee treatment, and day-to-day operations go through people who actually understand those areas. Jake turned to address the group of employees. Betty becomes head of all livestock operations. Carlos takes charge of horse training and breeding programs. Everyone gets promoted to positions that match their actual skills and experience, not just their ability to kiss up to the boss. The excitement among the ranch hands was palpable. For years, they had watched incompetent decisions being made by someone who didn't understand their work. The possibility of actually having their expertise valued was almost too good to believe. And, what about our guests here? Blackstone asked, gesturing toward his wealthy friends. What are they going to think about all this? The attorney stepped forward. Personally, I think it's brilliant. You've stumbled into a partnership that could actually work. Jake here has proven he understands animals and people. You've got business experience and connections. Together you could build something special. The silver-haired man nodded in agreement. Richard, I've been watching you struggle with this ranch for years. You've poured money into it, but it never seemed to run smoothly. Maybe it's time to try a different approach. But Jake wasn't finished with his revelations. There's something else you all should know, he said, his voice taking on a different tone. I haven't been entirely honest about my background. Everyone turned to look at him with renewed interest. When I told you I lost my family's ranch, that was true. But I didn't tell you why I was so confident about working with Thunder, or how I knew so much about horse behavior. Jake took a deep breath before continuing. Before my family got into financial trouble, I was a professional horse trainer. I specialized in working with traumatized and difficult animals. I competed in rodeos, worked with law enforcement mounted units, and trained horses for therapeutic riding programs. The crowd stared at him in amazement. I also have a degree in animal psychology from Texas A&M, and I spent 2 years working as a ranch foreman in Montana before coming home to help. My family with their operation? Blackstone's mouth fell open. You have a college degree, you're a professional trainer? The financial problems that cost us our ranch started with my father's heart attack, Jake explained. The medical bills were enormous, and we had to sell off our livestock to pay them. Then drought hit our area 2 years in a row, and we couldn't make the loan payments. By the time we lost everything, I was emotionally and financially devastated. Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. When I showed up here 3 months ago, I was broken. I'd lost not just my family's ranch, but my identity and my confidence. I took the job as a stable hand because it was all I could handle at the time. But working here, watching how things were done, slowly reminded me of who I used to be. Betty shook her head in wonder. You let us all think you were just some down-on-his-luck cowboy when you were more qualified than anyone here to run this place.